Right, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us at this webinar this afternoon. My name is Neille. I'm a journalist with Daily Maverick and the co-director of an up-and-coming documentary called Influence. With me today is my co-director and South Africa's favorite bedtime story author, Richard Poplak. I'm joking. Richard is the editor-at-large at Daily Maverick and a foremost political thinker and writer in South Africa. Also joining us today, we're very, very excited about it to have Nigel Oakes with us. Nigel is a pioneer of soft power, and we're very excited to unpack that a bit with you, Nigel. Actually, we'd like to do his introduction a little differently today, so we thought we would play a clip from our upcoming film Influence. Have a look.
I am a weapons builder, and proud of it.
I am a weapons builder and proud of it.
Quite infamous for my
I've become quite infamous for my association with the Cambridge Analytica
campaign. It's come under fire for allegedly misusing the Facebook data of millions of users.
And I've become quite an amateur historian of the whole influence industry. Advertising. It all starts from advertising. It was the work that was done in advertising that enabled us to progress and to develop the strategic communication that we had today. It was only when I started working in researches that I began to realize that there's a very big difference between informing people through advertising or even trying to change their attitude and actually changing their behavior.
What is that?
Guys, I've got an alarm going in my background. I'm so sorry. It's going to turn off automatically. I can't deal with it at the moment. There you are. It's gone.
Okay, perfect. Appropriate.
Technical difficulties. All right, Rich, you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the clip that we saw there, I think there was a bit of echo on that, a little bit of sound issues, but I think the gist came across. And Nigel, you introduce yourself in our movie as a weapons builder. And I think it's very important that we delve into this conversation talking about the difference between the types of weapons that have suddenly become in vogue today. The difference between kinetic weapons, bombs, guns, etc., and non-kinetic weapons, which are the weapons of war that you have helped pioneer. So can you give us a little bit of background, please, on how you got into this business, how you helped pioneer the influence industry, and help us understand some of the techniques?
Yeah, certainly. We have to go all the way back to the 1970s and 1980s to start with, where advertising was starting to really grow. But advertising was coming out of the world of art and creativity. So, I mean, the original ads of like Bubbles, which was painted by a famous artist to sell Pears soap, came from a traditional Royal Academy artist. And this type of art and creativity coming into advertising came all the way through, so that by the time you got to the 70s and 80s, an advertising agency had a creative department which was supposed to design messages and images in an enticing, exciting way, which was supposed to influence the audience. And in some cases they did. This is where the world of jingles and funny slogans and funny TV commercials came from. And it was very good for the time. But there was a critical flaw in this approach. First of all, it was very hit and miss. Sometimes you did commercials which were very successful and no one was quite sure why. And other times they just completely failed or even made the sales of your product go down in some cases. So the famous line, 50% of my advertising works, but I don't know which half, that was a big joke in the 1980s. But actually, it's no joke. The fact is that 50% of your advertising, which costs millions or tens of millions, or today hundreds of millions, is just wasted. But nonetheless, in the 80s, this was the very big billions of dollars being spent on advertising. And some of the largest companies like Saatchi's, Ogilvy and Mather, J. Walter Thompson were winning huge accounts and basically trying to influence people through these media. There was no internet or online didn't exist. So you basically had TV commercials, print and press ads and radio, and that was basically it. Now, if you had a serious issue that you needed to get across to your audience, such as don't smoke, smoking's bad for you, smoking will kill you, and as a government we're thinking of changing the law, you had to pretty much go to an advertising agency and say, well, can you persuade people not to smoke? Well, of course, advertising agencies are commercial companies. They're trying to make money. So they will take your money and run your account to try and do this. But they had spectacularly poor results at doing these types of campaigns. And nobody really worked it out at the time, but subsequently it became obvious what it was, which was advertising agencies were quite good at informing you of stuff or making you think or even potentially changing your attitudes to stuff, but were particularly bad at changing your behavior. And changing your behavior is really where it counts. I was working at Saatchi's, but I'd come from a musical background where you really had to make the audience, your job as a musician was to try and influence the audience through emotions, make them happy or sad or, basically. And if you couldn't do that, it was really not a very good piece of music that you'd written. But I came from that era. So when I came into Saatchi's and found that the stuff that they were doing just wasn't really hitting the behavioral change, I said, well, look, I believe there's a gap in the market. And I wasn't thinking this as a commercial thing. I just genuinely thought, that there must be a role for communication that can change behavior. I mean, at the time, what I said was communication that genuinely works, because I wasn't impressed with the advertising approach. And even if you go back to Aristotle, 2,000 years ago to Greece, pretty much the most important thing in terms of democracy and government at that stage was what Plato and Aristotle called rhetoric, the ability to convince your fellow man, because we can't all be individuals in this world. So I took this and very clearly, I'm not a scientist, I'm a musician, really. So I was pulling together strands of science that were from universities around the world, and I pulled them together into an organization that we called the Behavioral Dynamics Institute. And the idea of this institute was it would further the academic knowledge of communication to change behavior. And actually, that's a very important starting point, because it sort of underpins the whole theory of strategic communication. If you're just focusing on behavior change, then it becomes obvious which jobs you then go on to do. You don't try and sell baked beans or cars or whatever. Where is behavior important? And behavior is important in elections because you actually want people to vote. It's important in military because you actually want people to stop fighting. And I'm just going to caveat a tiny bit on that, because you said, Richard, to explain the kinetic. We were very excited at that stage, the various scientists and myself, and I very much put myself at the bottom of the pile, because some of the scientists who were working with us were brilliant top scientists, and I was not a top scientist, so I was learning as I went, as it were. But they were very excited because they were providing a weapon that didn't require force. Now, in the moral and ethical equations, we were on the right side. We were saying, if you use this, you can stop people dying on both sides. It's really very primitive trying to a soldier hide in a trench and shoot the other guy. or firing from a distance, or lobbing missiles over. If you can resolve your conflict or make it go away using communications, i.e. changing the behavior of the enemy, this must be a good thing for society. And on that basis, a lot of scientists worldwide and a lot of money came in to develop that knowledge and that academia, as it were. So we got to basically 1990, 1991 with this new pseudoscience. I mean, it's unfair to call it pseudoscience because it wasn't fake science. It was based on very, very solid social science that had been developed over the last 50 years, but it had never been put forward together in a central pot. So it'd be unfair to call it a new type of science, but it was basically using existing science and turning it into something that Harvard Business School called actionable science. It was taking the science and making it real in the world of communication, which made a huge difference, but most importantly, made it measurable. Because we were dealing with science, because we could measure the input into the communication, we could measure the audience, we could measure the output. And now suddenly we had something that people understood. You put money in to get a job done and you could measure whether it was done correctly or not. And that was the birth of strategic communication. That's where it started from.
Now, Nigel, so you say you started out as a musician and you had a very specific understanding of what an audience was and what you could elicit within that audience from a musical or performative perspective. And you've painted this kind of progression very, very well for us. At the time, there was really only advertising, as you say. Political communications was only really starting to become a practice or a discipline, if you can call it that, through the likes of Lord Tim Bell, for example. But tell us what the examples were, those early examples, the case studies, if you will, that you started to look into that made you realize and started to focus you more in I suppose, a political direction with regard to elections and the like.
So for 3 years, so we established the BDI, the Behavioral Dynamics Institute, in 1989. For 3 years, we literally just ran, scientific trials. So we offered to do projects for people just to see what worked and what didn't work. And believe me when I say that quite an amount didn't work. I mean, we had to take a lot of the science. We had to try things, find out that they made absolutely no difference at all. One of the things we looked at the time was subliminal advertising. You may have heard anecdotally the stories of people flashing Coca-Cola images on a screen in a cinema and everybody rushing out at the interval to go. And it's just rubbish. If an image it doesn't get past your rational system and you can't perceive it, there's no subliminal or sub-rational element that can process it. So, but we went down all these false roads in order to come up with stuff that did work. So we looked at lots of different things. We looked at auctions. We looked at, could we influence an audience in auctions, and what bits of an audience we needed to understand. But I want to bring in a very important point at this stage. It sounds as if strategic communication is very manipulative, because it sounds like what you're trying to do is to almost trick an audience into doing what it is that you want. But there's another side of the coin, which is the more you learn about what an audience wants, the more you learn about how to trick them. And so you end up tricking them by giving them what they want, at which point you're not really tricking them. In a funny sort of way, it's the worst type of thing is to do what the advertising agencies were trying to do. That is more offensive, when we try and fire stuff at you that you're really not interested in the hope that you might be stupid enough to buy it. However, if I bother to really learn what it is that you want and that what turns you on, as it were, and I give that to you, and you go, oh, okay, but under those circumstances, I might be interested, then you don't feel you've been tricked. So it's very important to understand that this, although it appears that the people with the money are getting what they want because they can pay to use these weaponized systems to get what they want, that there is a second component in here, which is that the audience may very well be happy to be in that position. They may very well say, you know, you haven't lied to us. Sorry, there's a lawnmower going past, I apologize. And it may be that the audience is a component of the persuasion process. I mean, the idea that you could come up with a message that was so magically effective that people would just go, oh yes, I'll do that because that message is so exciting. That it doesn't work like that. And the clever part of influence, if you like, is the ability to actually press the buttons of the audience that the audience want. I'll talk about that a bit later on when talking about the Trump campaign and that sort of thing.
But I guess that leads us quite nicely then into the tools that you were then asked to use in 1994. We might as well jump right in because I think people are really fascinated to know. And that was from the interviews that we conducted with you for Influence last year in England. We know that was one of your early major campaigns and indeed your first geopolitical campaign. Am I correct?
Yes.
I do just want to give a little bit of context here because I think it's important to note that the election industrial complex that we now understand and rightly fear really kicked off after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when there were a bunch of emerging democracies all over the world, in the former Soviet bloc, here in Africa. All of a sudden, there are dozens of opportunities to test out the weapons and the tools that you and others had developed at the time. So I want you to take us back to 1993. You're asked to come to South Africa to work on our first democratic election campaign.
Okay, so we were actually asked, as it were, in 1993, as you rightly say, a year before the election, and we weren't open for business. It was Behavioral Dynamics, the institute, that was asked, not SCL, which then became the company. And we have no idea how they found out that we were working and researching in this element. But there was a lot of, you might call, rich financiers behind Behavioral Dynamics, and it's quite likely that people in South Africa were aware of what we were doing. So we were called in a very, very strange way. We were called up in London at our office, which was still Behavioral Dynamics, and we were called up by a lawyer who said, we want you to come in and basically do a beauty parade. You've got to come and answer a whole lot of questions. And we said, oh, well, this is jolly exciting. You know, no one's ever wanted us before. So we went in and we answered a whole lot of questions. And then we never heard anything. And then about 3 weeks later, we were called back and we came back in and we answered a whole lot more, and then went back and didn't hear anything. And then we were called. And at the third time we said, well, hold on a second. I mean, this could, you know, we were naive in the business world. We said, people are just learning everything that we've just spent 3 years and millions of pounds, dollars researching. We don't understand what's going on. So we said, no, we wouldn't come back for the third time unless we knew what behind it, what was going on. They said, understood, but they weren't going to tell us. And we thought that was the end of it. And then about a week after that, we got a call from them saying that they wanted to come to our offices, which they did. And they briefed us and said, we want you to go down to South Africa and help the ANC. And we said, okay, but is this the ANC paying for it? And it was like, no, definitely not. And we said, who's paying for it? And they said, well, we're not going to tell you. So under those circumstances, do you want to go? And we said, yes, we will go, but we insist on going into the ANC and making sure that we're working alongside them. We can't support them from outside the organization. But they still wouldn't tell us who was paying for it. So I and a couple of other people flew down to Johannesburg, where the ANC offices were. We stayed in a very nice hotel in Santon, I think it was called. And we went into the ANC offices, which was a lot of security. You had to go through metal detectors and all sorts of things before you got in. And the first person I was introduced to was, and I'm afraid I don't remember his name, but it was the finance director of the ANC at the time. And he was a very nice man. He didn't have many teeth, I remember, but he was a very nice man, and he was managing all of the finances as they were for the party. And then we were introduced to a very bright lady called Jill Marcus, who I believe is still in the political sphere in the country. And she made it very clear that whatever we did, we weren't going to get paid any money from the ANC. And we said, no, don't worry about that. We're not here to ask for money. And she said, well, anything that you can do to support and help, this will be very, very beneficial, especially if we're not paying for it. But you need to meet the next person up the chain, whereupon we were then briefed by Cyril Ramaphosa, who at the time was important in the party, in the organization, but everything basically revolved around, obviously, Mandela at the time. So there was nobody who was really important in the ANC other than Mandela. And, it was still pre-election time. It was still very much hugely in apartheid time. So we very much felt that we were in almost a revolutionary organization that hadn't achieved the revolution yet. And I know that's difficult to imagine looking back, whatever it is, 26 years. But, the ANC, even though it represented a vast amount of the country, was still a second-class citizen organization. And the people in it knew that. They weren't, just because you were high up in the ANC, it didn't make you high up in the opposition of the country. You weren't in government. You were just a sort of a community organization. So we were briefed, and we were briefed on an extraordinary thing. In the very brilliant film Influence, you tell the story of basically Tim Bell working for the other side. Well, the other side, the National Party, had a huge task on their hands. They had to use every influence trick that they knew. They didn't know many, so they resorted to a lot of brute force and really very immoral, unethical tricks, which I'll tell you some of them in a minute. But our job was very, very different. We weren't asked to convince the majority of the country to vote for Nelson Mandela. I mean, that was de facto. You didn't have to convince anybody to vote for Nelson Mandela. This was the great opportunity that the country had been working and waiting for years. So there was no influence in that component. We were brought in for a very specific reason. We were brought in because at the time, and again, I'm asking you to go back 26 years and imagine a very different time. Many of the Black community lived in townships. Education was almost non-existent. Not only non-existent, it was deliberately dumbed down, basically to keep the Black community stupid. And I apologize for saying that in such a blunt way, but that's exactly how it was designed to be. The Black education system was a second-class education system, and part of the design of it was definitely a power play by the white government. I think that certainly the academics all know this. I apologize if it's horrifying to hear on a webinar, but I'm quite sure that people watching know that was to be the case, and that was true. Now, this meant that asking people to vote, people with quite low literacy at that level, was a tricky job. And that meant that people in the townships were going to be asked to sign a bit of paper, which maybe they couldn't read, maybe they didn't understand, but most importantly, any piece of white paper that you'd signed previously, usually meant you were about to be arrested and carted off to prison or something. I mean, the whole concept of being asked to sign bits of paper and was a white domain thing, and that's not what people wanted. People, wanted Mandela and the black freedom. They didn't want to play a white man's game of trickery with elections and ticking boxes and that sort of thing. So we had to start our campaign, and this was the vast majority of the campaign, which was to encourage the black voters to vote, because it was they didn't trust anything, and they'd never been given the opportunity to vote. They didn't really understand elections. Now, I said I'd tell you some of the other tricks from the other side. Whilst we were doing this, we were being confronted by an alternative campaign that was being run by, I don't want to say which party, we can all guess, but I actually have no proof as to exactly which party it was, or whether Tim Bell was involved. Incidentally, it wasn't Bell Pottinger at that time. He was actually in an organization called Low Bell, which was basically his breakaway from Saatchi's. And the campaign that they were running was literally, and I kid you not, was to show people in the townships the fact that you'd have 3 boxes or 4 boxes which they could tick, and we all know what we do against people that we don't like. We put a cross. That is a negative thing. If you don't like them, put a cross in. Now that was the level of sophistication, if you like, of the campaigns we were up against. But people who had never been given the chance to vote before, people who had really no concept of what democracy, or all they wanted to do was to support Mandela. They understood that. Everybody in the townships understood that. Everybody was waiting, but they didn't want to go through this administrative white man's route to get there. And our job was to help them understand that they've got to do that. And we basically had no option but to co-opt the leaders in the township, which were not only the administrative leaders, but also the religious leaders, to say, you have got to vote. Because the big danger, there were 2 tasks that the National Party had to try and do. One was to stop enough people voting so that they could force that the ANC couldn't demand a new constitution, because that required a specific amount of votes. And the other thing is that enough people had to vote in order to make it constitutionally valid as an electoral vote. So our job, very simply, was just to try and push as much people there as possible. Something that I said in the film, which was refuted in the film, understandably, you have to understand people have to protect their positions. I mean, but again, I think anybody with an ounce of common sense knows that the vast majority of the country wanted to vote for Mandela. I mean, you didn't need to do polls or be an expert to go, well, the vast majority of the black community is going to vote for Mandela and the vast majority of the white community isn't. And you could work out what the results of the election were going to be before you even started. Equally well, the only problematic area were the Inkatha Freedom Party and Chief Buthelezi. Now, the reason why there was problems with from the Inkatha Freedom Party before the elections was as a direct result of the meeting, which went wrong. And the meeting was meant to be, the ANC gets roughly 60 to 70% of the vote, National Party gets roughly 20% of the vote, Inkatha Freedom Party gets roughly 10% of the vote. And Chief Buthelezi said, no way, why am I getting 10%? This is my opportunity. It should be more like ANC gets 60%, I get 20 or 30%, and basically that's where the disagreement came, and that's where all the fighting started for before the election, as they were fighting on those elements. So the actual final result turned out something pretty close to that. It was, I think, it was between 60 and 65 that ANC, 20-ish for National Party, and 10. It was pretty much as agreed. It went on. But the idea that it was free and fair elections and everybody voted and all the votes were counted and there were only 1,600 spoiled, I mean, this is ridiculous. It's I mean, the vast number of votes were estimated because it had to be. But for the electoral commissioners, they obviously couldn't say that. They have to be seen to say it was fair and it was all, but it was fair because the right party got in. It probably would have been fairer if they'd been allowed to change the constitution at the time, but it was definitely a very, very big first step.
Well, you're giving spoilers to the film here, Nigel. So just be careful. But obviously this is the big point of contention, right? That we try, that we handle, I feel, quite comprehensively in the film. But obviously there's so much more to say about it, which is the Constitution, which was the most important decision making factor at that time, was whether the NP would get that 2/3, or not the 2/3 majority, but the second seat at the table, essentially, which would allow them to influence and have a massive impact on that process. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about why the constitution making process was so crucial, and why it meant so much to the NP to be in that position. They knew they weren't going to win. They were never going to win, as you say, in a country just raring to vote for Mandela. But they knew that they needed to keep that second seat. And perhaps you could just talk a little bit about why that was so important.
Well, look, I have to be really honest, Diana. It's that I like to consider myself as a sort of a bit of a amateur expert on the influence side, but actually I'm a bit of an idiot when it comes to the political side, because our job starts and stops with we need people to do this. As to why it's so important constitutionally, I have no idea. I mean, obviously, we all know that if you could rewrite the constitution, you could basically rewrite the National Party out of the equation. So there are lots of things that you can't do if you can't change the constitution. But beyond that, I'm just not an expert in that side of it, and I wouldn't pretend to be. Which slightly leads into the morality, which is I know people will be looking at me and go, "You immoral, scumbag for being involved in this type of work." But it's important to understand that we don't have an axe to grind in this. This is like a doctor fixing a patient, and you can't say, "Oh, but this is a mass murderer that you're saving this life of." You say, "Well, that's not my moral decision. That's people much higher than me who make those decisions. I just do the job I'm asked to do." So I don't know.
Well, let me ask you this. As you said, the important part of the job that you were figuring out at the time as you were developing the Behavioral Dynamics Institute was how to make it measurable. So did you walk away from that experience in South Africa feeling that you had a measurable outcome, a measurable result? I guess the fact that the ANC won the election with some change to spare was a good result. But were there other measurable factors that you felt were important that you learned from?
Yeah. So there's in any influence campaign, there's three areas that you measure. First of all, you have to measure very accurately the situation at the beginning, and that's where we realized we had such a big problem, because so many people in the townships basically were saying, well, we're not going to participate in the election because we suspect it's going to be a trick. So we started off from a very low but measurable base. You then measure the various attempts at the campaign that you're doing. One of the things that we tried and failed was to communicate directly to the people. This didn't work at all because they didn't trust the communication. The townships operated on a very much an informal power structure, which was if he said it and he was told by him and she was told by him and they were told by chief and the chief was discussing it with the bishop, and that's how it worked. And we had to use those channels. So we found out what didn't work, measured those things, and ended up measuring the stuff that did work, and then used that. Now, towards the end of every campaign, you do a thing called MOE, which is a measurement of effectiveness, which can measure a whole range of different things. In the case of this campaign, it was just more important to get as many people as possible. And I can't remember the exact results, but we definitely had a major effect on the townships in terms of them voting. To say that we made a difference in the election would be a vast overclaim, because there was no way in which the ANC weren't going to win the election anyway.
So Nigel, I think it's important to note that these were very sophisticated elections. I think it's also important to note that there were a lot of outside experts and local experts that were working within the context of all of the different political parties. I think it would be I think there's some sort of misunderstanding that you guys were actually running the ANC's election campaign on the ground. Give us a sense of how many players were here during the '94 campaign, and give us a sense perhaps of the size of your operations relative to those other operators.
And perhaps I could just add a little bit of context. We have a comment here from one of our viewers, Nikki Moore, who says, "I worked for the IEC during the 1994 elections, and there was never any question of influence or manipulation. It was so chaotic and reactionary that any strategy was completely impossible." So perhaps you could put that into context as well, Nigel.
Let me answer that question first, and then I'll come back to you, Richard. I totally agree with Nikki. I mean, that's a very accurate statement, which is sort of what I was saying. I mean, the idea that there was coordinated ballot box counting and everybody was able to measure the votes and get them back to a central thing. It was chaos, and let me say it was deliberate chaos, where it was possible to disrupt the process of free and fair elections. Believe me, every possible trick and technique was put into play to make it difficult. So I'm not in any way criticizing the IEC. They had an impossible job to do, but just as they portrayed it as if it was a very free and fair, everybody counted the votes, this is what the results were. This is ridiculous. I mean, it was, you couldn't even travel on some of the roads because the roads were blocked because there were people burning buses and stuff on the roads. I mean, this was not an easy area to operate in. And so the chaos was a very fair comment. Going back to what Richard said, is how many people were on the ground. In your film, I for the first time saw a gentleman which I'd never seen before, who called himself the ANC campaign manager, and he obviously did a very good job.
That was Ketso Gordon, who effectively ran the campaign. Yes. Yeah,
I'd never heard of him or met him before in my life, and this also highlights the fact that there were so many different organizations working in so many different areas supporting the ANC or supporting anti-apartheid. It might be, you could have called it at that stage. And so the job that we were doing, as I sort of explained, was not anti-Tim Bell or anti-National Party or even pro-ANC. It was to enable the black community to vote. So it would be perfectly fair to say that that wasn't really an ANC campaign at all, even though we'd come through the ANC. It wasn't financed by the ANC. It was approved by the ANC, but certainly clearly wasn't part of their strategic approach. So there were many, many foreign people on the ground, some serious political experts, some people like myself, who at that stage were beginners, amateurs, really. We were still trying things out. We weren't, they didn't bring in the world's leading experts. We weren't the world's leading experts at the time, even though we might have liked to think we were. The fact is we were quite young and we were trying things out, many of which didn't work. But there were some serious experts in there, serious election experts. And remember that this wasn't just, this is the first proper election that South Africa had ever had. So lots of people were turning up going, I can tell you how to do this. A lot of people there at the time.
Now, Nigel, isn't it sort of creepy that there were all these players on the ground in South Africa in '94, which was, I'm not saying was probably the case, it was certainly the case in other burgeoning democracies elsewhere in the world around the same time. This feeding frenzy, which we, I guess we sort of refer to as the democracy industrial complex. This feeding frenzy, has it led to freer, fairer, and more rational election campaigns? Or is there something diseased about this sort of snake's pit of expertise that we're working here in 94 and elsewhere in the world around about the same time?
It's, I mean, the simple answer is it's very diseased, and there's no question about that. It's basically paid for manipulation on a grand scale, and whereas paid for manipulation, is always bad. In the past, it didn't really work. Just people having a go. Now it's become scientifically based and measurable. It's become far more effective, far more powerful, and it's still paid manipulation. So you sort of can say, well, in which box, therefore, is that not horrific and bad? But you have to slightly take it into a wider context than that. Because if you look at previously what people would try and do to influence, you get back into the bribery and the force. So in 1994, in the idea of the National Party using Tim Bell in South Africa wasn't considered a negative, because the National Party was using a very agreed and understood form of political instrument, which was election campaigning through communication. Now, I mean, the really dramatic stuff that people could and should and probably are looking at is what the National Party that we're doing outside the domain of communication, where I'm quite sure there was a fair amount of strong arm work going on, and there's bribery and persuading people, turning people against each other. You mentioned that in the film as well. And I won't give it away as a spoiler, but it's a really interesting line that needs to be followed up. And so then you say, and of course, these negative people doing communication. And you go, well, that's not that bad, is it, communication? And you go, well, yeah, but it's communication that really works. And you go, yeah, but it's still communication. I mean, it's you're not shooting people or threatening people or bribing people, or well, you're technically allowed to do this. So yes, manipulation through communication is very bad, but it's not as bad as turning up with military force with guns saying, if you don't vote for me, we'll shoot people, which, bear in mind, is still going on in quite a number of democracies around the world. So no, I'm not condoning institutionalized industrial manipulation, but for a very, very long time, it didn't work, and it was considered relatively benign. And what Tim Bell was doing was very, very rough tools, very primitive tools that didn't work terribly well at the time. And in fact, right the way through to the demise of Bell Pottinger, it wasn't exactly a sophisticated campaign they were trying to run. It became so obviously blunt and flawed that the public could see themselves what a ridiculous strategy it was. But for a long time, this type of communication was quite ineffective. Now it's become much more effective. So the question now arises: is it now too dangerous to allow it to be applied to democracy? And the answer is maybe. But just one final point I'm going to throw in on that, which is we have the same problem in the media. And I know I'm treading on some very sensitive toes here, but the media also has very sophisticated techniques, capabilities in order to put its side across. And that is, I would surmise, is equally flawed in terms of that sometimes the intention is very good, but actually the end result can often be just written off as, well, we did our best, even though we had the wrong outcome. And I think you have to use it to examine influence, manipulation, and the media in a sort of binary system. From a philosophical point of view, they are both flawed. But what is important is we're in a situation now where both are very dangerous. this is a particularly dangerous time where we've got Russia and China who have taken this weaponized approach incredibly seriously, and are now pumping billions of resources into this thing in order to basically take over the world via communication. And I think that's where your film, where Influence really starts opening up the question as to where to from here, because that is scary. That's very scary.
So, Nigel, I just want to touch one last time on your involvement here in South Africa, because I think some of the confusion about the work that you did arises from the fact that in terms of the understanding of democracy here in South Africa, especially from people coming up through the labor movement, there was actually an enormous amount of understanding and will from most of the population to become involved in the electoral process, to effectively put their ticks on a piece of paper. So when it comes down to the work that you were doing here, understanding that effectively you were walking into a pretty receptive environment as far as these things go, and a population that really was desperate to become involved in the democratic process, that had fought in some cases to the death to become involved in the electoral process. What exactly was the work that you're doing? I understand that you were coming in to help a recalcitrant element of the population, or was it much broader than that? Help us understand how that might have worked, and also what regions of the country you were operating.
Okay, it's first of all, we operated right the way across the country, wherever we could get to that was safe. It was quite a dangerous time at that time, and there was a lot of gangs operating. But I want to directly refute what you said at the beginning. And this may have been a misconception on my part, but I don't think so. It's you had the white community who all knew what they were doing. Then you had a layer of very, very bright black activists, politicians, people who weren't going to let this opportunity go. And I met some of the smartest black people, like Cyril Ramaphosa, who was, I mean, a very, very smart guy, much smarter than me and the team of people who we turned up with. And we basically interacted with that group of people, but below that there were, a society of people who had been oppressed, for years across the country, and it's rewriting history to say that these people were all understood exactly what was going on, wanted to be part of the electoral process. Many of these people didn't know what an election was. I mean, they never had one. I mean, they had read books about one. I mean, the idea that many of these people were able to express their vote is just not true. It wasn't a society where everybody was, just on the edge of all we need to do is now. To say that we had, right the way across the country, we had people who were following Mandela and wanted the change. Yes, I mean, pretty much, except for the ones that were paid for by the National Party, you wouldn't find a black person who wasn't supporting Mandela. I mean, there were some, obviously, but the actual result of the election, if you'd had it run it fairly, would have probably been 75% of the country, which should have been very fair. So I'm not suggesting for a second that everybody wasn't desperate to end the oppression and end apartheid and see Mandela running the country. But the idea that they all wanted to do it in an electoral system and understood what democracy was like, or even understood what the process of an election was, or that they had to tick a box, or what political parties were, this just did not exist in vast areas of the country. I mean, and I'm talking about pretty much anywhere outside the major cities. And I think people from that time would come back and you know, I mean, it's easy to forget what life was like 26 years ago, pre-Facebook, pre-internet, few television channels, but life was quite primitive, deliberately primitive at that time. So no, I don't think there was a burgeoning group of you know, intellectual society just ready for the change, waiting for the electoral system to give them opportunity. This was a vast mass of people who knew what they wanted but didn't know how to get it. Some had already started an approach into violence, and that had to be. And I tell you, the leaders in the townships were magnificent in persuading people not to turn to violence, if at all possible, and explaining that this was the opportunity to do it through a democratic process. But that's the level that it was. It was no more advanced than that. Okay,
well, we're getting a lot of pushback on that, I think, Nigel. But I think, I tend to agree. I think there was with some of the comments here, there was a lot of sophistication on the ground. But I want to move on to because we don't have a whole lot of time left. I want to move on to some of the latest stuff that you've been involved in, however tangentially. Can you explain BDI's, however tangential, involvement in Trump 2016?
Yeah, so behavioral dynamics was the science that led into an operational company, which was called Strategic Communication Laboratories, or SCL Group, and that operated on a whole range of elements, as I said before, the things which required behavioral change. So obviously the military, it was a very powerful thing. If you could use it as a weapon rather than killing people, that was very powerful. It was used by governments in order to help communicate with people, not necessarily in a political format. It was used to a certain extent commercially, although not very much. And then, of course, we had the political element, which was largely just electoral campaigns. And the bit that was spun off of SCL Group was called Cambridge Analytica. And the thing about Cambridge Analytica is it used all of the scientific knowledge from the behavioral dynamics group, but it also added a whole new component to it, which was the digital analysis, data analysis, the ability to basically reanalyze data, whether it be Facebook data or credit card data or purchase history data or whatever, to group people into segments that might be more understandable, approachable. And you can see in an election campaign, obviously, if you can identify that somebody likes buying guns, they are more likely to be responsive to a Republican message than somebody who doesn't. So from a very simple process, you can start segmenting audience groups into very tight and accurate psychometric profiles by basically analyzing the data. But the behavioral dynamics element of the campaign, I think, was much more interesting. And again, we had a Democrat and Republican sort of trade-off where everybody in America was used to the boring political campaigns. And the boring political campaigns talked about education, taxation, foreign policy, administrative budgets, and actually stuff that the average man or woman on the street didn't really care about that much. And so now you had an opportunity of a new president who really had zero political understanding, expertise, and he came in and he wanted something very different. He wanted to appeal to the real feelings of the people. So he went in and said, well, obviously my objective is to win the election. I want to win votes. I therefore want to press the buttons of the people in an area which really matters to them, because they don't give a damn what my foreign policy is going to be or whatever. They don't understand it. But I want to press buttons on things that they do understand. So just one of the things which people will be aware of was the Rust states in the lower end of the country, bordering Mexico. There were some very big problems because basically the border had become porous. Lots of people were walking across the border, lots of Mexicans, And because they weren't registered in the US, because they shouldn't have been there, they were able to do jobs, all sorts of jobs, carpenter, plumber, building, and whatever, didn't have to worry about taxes, insurances, or whatever. So they could charge far less as a daily rate. And they were putting an enormous amount of people out of work in those southern states. So once you understood that, you could then understand what really mattered to the voters there. That, you know, these are people who really felt the fact that they couldn't they couldn't buy something nice for their wives, or the wives couldn't do something nice for the kids, because these illegal immigrants had come across the country and were taking all the money, all the jobs, all the whatever. So it was a big emotional, visceral response against these people.
So effectively what you're saying, Nigel, is that you looked at what voters wanted in the southern states, that what their primary concerns were, and started to use that as effectively a weapon within the Trump campaign. So I guess the question I have, especially when it comes to something as inflammatory as immigration rights, and they are rights within the United States, what is the morality in using these tools? Because if we take a look at what you say you were doing here in South Africa in '94, sort of combine that with the work that you were doing with the Trump campaign in 2016, what is the morality of these tools, especially when you're lighting a match under what we could say is racial divisions in a place like South Africa, or the very fraught notion of immigration rights in the United States of America? What of the morality of these tools? I mean, when you say immigrants are stealing jobs, that in itself is Trumpish language. That in itself is inflammatory language. So explain to us how these tools work when effectively what you have in your hands is these nuclear bombs.
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer, but there's always two sides to the question. If you're, I mean, having been involved in political campaigns all my life, there's pretty much always, you're going to upset 50% of the people who go, well, you shouldn't be using that. And then the 50% that's on your side go, well, I think it's okay to use that as long as it's on our side. And everybody thinks that their own morality is the right thing. But I maintain a very simple position on this, is that I'm not smart enough or bright enough to make moral judgments myself. I famously have said I have no moral compass, because a lot of what I've designed is used for good. A lot of what I've designed has been used for bad. And often stuff that was used for good has now turned out to be bad. And, at no point can you say, working for NATO against the opposition in the Gulf War, that was considered very good, up until the point where it then started to look like as if it was an illegal war. And then you go, well, that was very bad. But then if we've been working for the enemy, if we've been working for Saddam Hussein, that would have been very bad. But now people might say, well, actually, it was actually quite good because they were trying to save their country. So it's very, very difficult to make ethical judgments.
Fair enough. But I mean, I just want to push you on one thing, and that is, again, when we start talking about the rights of the individual in the work that you do, where do you feel that lands? Because if we're talking about elections, effectively what your job, as you've explained, going back to '94, is to sway large parts of the population to do a certain thing. Where do individual rights come into all of this? Where does, and again, I want you to touch on the moral aspects of it, because I think it's important. I think there are good guys and there are bad guys. So, and I think we all kind of inherently know where we stand on those lines. So just touch on that a little bit as we start rounding it to the end here.
Okay, so the work that I'm involved in is never with individuals. What we are trying to do is to get groups to operate as groups, exactly like is happening in COVID right now. It's every individual can say, well, I have a right to be me, and I want to do this, and my human right is to go out into the street and live my life as normal. But from a group point of view, that is not fair. From a group point of view, everybody has to respect that you may not die from COVID, but there's a bunch of other people who might if you operate as an individual. So you've got to think as a group. Political campaigns, by very definition, are group. There's no way a politician can do the work, do the bidding of 25 million individuals. He or she has to operate by trying to represent them as a group, whether that group is 100,000 or 1 million or whatever. Do they do it for the right reason? Do they not do it for the right reason? Is it moral? Is it not moral? The question is all the way through. You can say that using immoral means to put a moral person in power, is that right? Is that wrong? Is it means and tools? It's a very, very difficult thing. Manipulation per se is a dangerous weapon, and it is basically goes to the highest bidder. The highest bidder can pay for it, and that opens up all sorts of doors for manipulation, for negative outcomes, for distorting democracy. But it can also be used to persuade a country to stay indoors and lockdown and save thousands of lives. That again is against individual rights, but is that good or bad? And very genuinely, I'm not trying to get out of answering the question here. I genuinely don't know that I'm qualified to say I'm a good guy or a bad guy. I just say I'm amoral. I have no idea.
And I think that's where we'll need to leave it, Nigel. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our hour. It's gone so quickly. But I think the important thing to note here, obviously, to our viewers at home, thank you for watching. There's many questions that have been raised in this session, and we hope that many of them will be answered in Influence. But the important thing for us is that these conversations are being had in the first place, which is why we made the film and why we wanted to have this conversation today. Because I think that the more citizens understand what processes and indeed weapons are being used behind the scenes in the furtherance of political objectives, financial objectives, the better informed we are, the better decisions we can ultimately make at the end of the day. And it's important for us as journalists and as citizens to engage with these topics and to learn to reach out and to find out as much as possible about how our democracies are being subverted, controlled, and furthered in specific ways. And hopefully today was just a look behind the scenes of how certain processes work. So we do hope you found some value today. Nigel, thank you so much for your time. And
Diana, I think we should let people know that Influence, which the movie, unpacks a lot of these things in great detail. There'll be a big announcement coming soon. We keep saying this, but it is coming soon. A big announcement coming soon when the film will be released. And once again, Influence itself was designed to ask a lot of these very, very difficult, very, very troubling questions. And we will not stop doing our jobs effectively of trying to get to the bottom of what's happened to our democracies. So thank you very, very much for participating with us, guys.
Thank you very much.
thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.